Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to learn about the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is basically a part of the peripheral nervous system, and as we know, the nervous system itself comprises of a central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. But we're going to look at the autonomic nervous system today, particularly the two branches of it, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. Oh, okay. So before I go into that, what exactly is the autonomic nervous system? Okay, so basically, the autonomic nervous system controls things like, breathing, your heart, digestion, things like that. Basically, it controls things that you're not consciously aware of. Like, you don't think about digesting your food, you don't think about your heart beating, these are all things controlled by the autonomic nervous system, also known as the ANS system. So okay, and I won't get through that. Okay, so this is basically a brief structure of what the autonomic nervous system looks like. It consists of two neurons, so they're called the preganglionic fiber and the postganglionic fiber, arranged in this fashion here. So basically what happens is you have your first neuron here, so you get like a message sent across in the form of what's known as an action potential. So the action potential races along there. Once it gets up to here, it releases a neurotransmitter. In this case, the neurotransmitter would be acetylcholine. This then binds onto a receptor which is on the second neuron, or the postganglionic fiber. So this receptor is called the nicotinic receptor. So the acetylcholine basically binds to the nicotinic receptor, causes the second neuron to then fire an action potential, which then goes along. Once it hits the end, a neurotransmitter is released here, which then binds to receptor on your effector organ, and your effector organ can be your heart, your smooth muscle within your digestive system, etc. Yes. So this is the basic structure of what the ANS system looks like. However, there's some exceptions to this rule. So instead of having some, like for example, your sympathetic nerve leading to your adrenal medulla is just a single neuron. It's not two neurons. So that's an exception to this rule. But generally, the ANS system looks like this, consisting of two neurons, the preganglionic fiber and the postganglionic fiber. Now let's look at the difference between... Okay, so now let's look in more detail of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so as we can see, both systems consist of your two neurons. However, there are some key differences to note and similarities. So, for example, the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, as we can see, the first neuron both releases acetylcholine here. Okay, so that's all the same, and they both bind to the nicotinic receptors here. However, when we get up to here, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system differ quite substantially. So in the sympathetic nervous system, for example, we've got the release of noradrenaline on the second neuron, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, you have the release of acetylcholine, which then binds to muscarinic receptors here, whereas the noradrenaline up here in the sympathetic nervous system binds to alpha and beta adrenoceptors. So that's the key differences between these two systems. Now, so basically the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system have opposing action. So for example, the sympathetic nervous system would increase your heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system would decrease your heart rate. And the parasympathetic nervous system, for example, would increase digestion, whereas the sympathetic nervous system would decrease digestion. So they generally have opposing effects, but sometimes they can have the same effect. So for example, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system both stimulate your salivary glands to secrete saliva. So they're the same in that regard. And also, the sympathetic nervous system, for example, it causes the breakdown. It causes a process known as glycogenolysis, which is glycogen breakdown into glucose. And this makes sense because basically, well, to put it another way, the sympathetic nervous system basically represents your fight or flight response. So if a dog jumps in front of you, or if you're scared by something, this system here will kick in, whereas your parasympathetic nervous system is generally your rest and digest nervous system. So this is when you're in a relaxed state. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying before, the sympathetic nervous system causes breakdown of the glycogen into glucose, and this makes sense because you need a ready source of energy if you want to fight or flee from whatever the danger is. Yeah, so this is, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, it doesn't have any effect on glycogen breakdown. So this was a general brief overview of the parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.